we're talking about huge sectors of the American economy, the healthcare sector, the defense sector, that are almost entirely controlled by the private enterprises that profit from them and, in effect, control those sectors of the government that are designed to regulate or control them. And so, that's why people are more and more dissatisfied. So much money being spent. I mean, we have gigantic budget deficits, gigantic trade deficits. I mean, there's a very good chance that the dollar in the American economy might collapse in the foreseeable future. I mean, we're talking about a situation that I think is eerily reminiscent of what America was going through right before the financial collapse of 2008. I think China, Europe, the rest of the world regarded America as having exactly the right financial system to follow. In other words, we were booming, our economy was booming, we had very low employment, very low problems with the economy. In other words, we were doing very well. And it was just a house of mirrors. In other words, basically, a lot of these financial securities that we were issuing, the mortgage-backed securities, basically were houses of cards, and they all collapsed. In other words, we damaged the world economy tremendously because of our financial collapse. And after that, I think China and many other countries in the world became much more cautious about accepting American advice. I mean, look at, for example, the whole notion of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin now, I think it's up to like $1 trillion or $2 trillion of market value. It's basically, by most reasonable standards, it's a Ponzi scheme. In other words, it has no intrinsic value. The only reason it's considered valuable is that people are trading it back and forth. And some people have certainly become incredibly wealthy by trading Bitcoin, but it has no underlying value. And it absorbs tremendous amounts of energy from the United States and the rest of the world in terms of processing Bitcoins, mining Bitcoin. And at some point, the whole thing might suddenly collapse, which probably would cause a very deep recession in the United States. And so, that's the problem. In other words, if all these people who have been trading meme stocks that have no value, who've been trading, for example, stocks that are driven a stock market bubble, who've been basically trading Bitcoin with each other, if suddenly they lose all of their financial assets, America might see tremendous social upheaval of a sort we haven't seen for generations before. In a sense, I think there's a good deal of possibility that America is in what might classically be called a pre-revolutionary situation. In other words, there's such tremendous dissatisfaction across the country, dissatisfaction that's been spread for 10 or 20 years. I mean, again, more and more people are so suspicious of events of the past. And, it's because people basically don't believe the government acts in their own interests. They don't believe the government is honest. And that's why they voted for Donald Trump. I mean, they voted for Donald Trump in some cases because they supported Donald Trump, but in many other cases because they hated the enemies of Donald Trump, the American establishment. And that's why if Donald Trump is much less successful than many of them hope, if he ends up going back on many of his promises, if he ends up doing things that they feel betray them one more time, that might be the final straw. And then there really might be, sort of dramatic changes in American society that happen only very rarely in the country. Because, so many American people are just so incredibly fed up with so many things that have happened over the last 5 or 10 or 20 years that, it's not a healthy situation for our society.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹饪。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好，用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。